You're watching Deprogrammed. I'm Harrison Pitt. I'm a writer for the European Conservative, and I'm happy to be joined today by Evan Riggs, who is a freelance journalist, and Sebastian Milbank, who is the executive editor of The Critic. Now, Sebastian, Evan and I were very interested recently to read your latest piece in The Critic. I mean, there's a sort of common refrain on the right today in the Anglosphere that the kids are all woke, civilization is sort of going down the drain and all the rest of it for that reason, partly. There's no hope for the future. But your piece is called The Kids Are Alt-Right. And of course, you're talking about political demography on the continent as being slightly different as in the Anglosphere. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're writing in that piece?
Yes, I mean, I think the article sort of began when I started seeing some of the statistics come out of European elections that really surprised me. So I saw, for example, polling that suggested that in Sweden, the national populist Sweden Democrats were doing equally well with younger people as with older people. And there was similar polling in Italy, where there was some polling that suggested that, in fact, younger people were more likely to vote for the far left. And similarly, in the 2017 French presidential election, half of under 30s in the first round of voting voted for either Mélenchon or Le Pen.
Mélenchon being the left-wing
candidate.
So
either for the far left or the far right. Yeah. But overall, looking across Europe, generally speaking, left-wing, including left populist movements, generally weren't doing well. They sometimes had initial surges, as in Greece, but largely the left has fallen away, and most of this distant energy is being taken up by populist parties of the right.
And you think it's that dissident energy which they have which attracts young people?
Well, I think definitely, but I think it's also, what I identified in the article was, I think a lot of this is coming out of the shattering of mainstream politics in 2008. So, we saw the world economy collapse, the kind of great kind of neoliberal and neoconservative promises of a triumphant century of liberalism, the Fukuyama end of history. It didn't happen. A lot of young people feel that they haven't had the same material progress as their parents and grandparents, whilst also having to deal with many of the consequences of the social decline that happened in those same times, in terms of crimes, drugs, divorce. And I think in 2008 you saw a great reaction against globalization that the left was not successfully able to take the helm of. So left-wing populists, you see with Occupy Wall Street, they tore themselves apart over identity politics, and the right got organised, and they took the helm of the anti-globalization movement. I don't know how many of you remember 20 years ago, but that was a time when the anti-globalization was still a left-wing movement. You saw it in Mexico, in the left in North America and in Britain. There was a lot of anti-globalization energy. Even in sort of more moderate publications, you saw all sorts of things about let's reduce air miles, let's have fair trade, and all of that sort of left-wing anti-globalization has very much fallen away in the face of diversity politics. At the same time, the right was able to tell an incredibly coherent story, which was able to link the failure of globalization with an attack on tradition, on national identity, and on traditional culture. And I think that was a much more compelling story. It was a much more coherent one, and it's one that was actually able to mobilize people politically.
Yes.
So just to rewind a little bit, Sebastian, what would you say separates the alt-right from the right? What's the differentiating factor here? Is it populism? Is it this anti-globalization strain?
I think so. I think alt-right obviously is a phrase that's becomes very freighted. It's made for a good headline. But the phrase I tend to use in the article is, I think, national populism, because I think that broadly captures that there's a nationalist focus. It's populist, but it's often very diverse. So that although there was the unifying factor of, it was on the right, it was to do with nationhood, and it was populist, and though generally there was an agreement that, need to limit migration, be more protectionist economically, there was a sort of cultural Christianity. These things were shared in all of these movements, but where there was division some of these were very much like Christian Democrats were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I say that's probably, despite some of the propaganda you see, that's probably broadly true of something like Fidesz and the Law and Justice Party in Poland, but there are movements of the much further right. So, for example, the Golden Dawn
Party in Greece, which wants to turn immigrants into lampshades.
But also groups that sometimes get...
you often hear that rhetoric from the Golden Dawn Party in Greece. They're sort of stridently racist nitwit party, basically.
And the Confederacy, and then you get your Confederacy Party in Poland, and you also have, for example, Jobbik in Hungary. And I think Jobbik is an interesting case because it's part of the often much lauded Hungarian opposition.
Yes.
And Jobbik is an interesting case because it's the party that's had the single greatest growth amongst young people in Hungary. They're having extraordinary successes amongst young people. So that so that this isn't an article that's just it's not. I wouldn't say I was either hopeful or despondent in this article. I think there's a sign that European young people are more political than they're sometimes portrayed as being, and that they are trying to fight back against their circumstances. But that is sometimes going in quite dark directions.
And would it be true to say as well that there is a sort of there is a strange sort of brew of sort of a lot of right right wing talk on culture in this sort of insurgent political movements as they exist on the continent, but also mixed with a certain amount of leftism in economics. So for example, I have a friend called who writes for the European Conservative called Carlos, he's Spanish and he's a huge fan of Vox. And one of the things that he talks about a great deal is how one of the effects of mass immigration into European populations is that it undermines that sense of working class solidarity, which is the necessary precondition for any kind of sort of class politics. And so, for example, in areas in Spain where there is more immigration, there is also less unionization. And so a lot of people on the left are this anti-globalization move used to be a very sort of left-wing critique of capitalism run amok, capitalism internationalized, and all the rest of it. Whereas because of because of diversity politics, it's less politically correct for them to make that sort of observation today. So that the point is that the right on the continent has taken this electoral high ground and it's very fertile electoral territory, and it's doing better, and the left has sort of crumbled and fallen away. Do you think that to bring it back to Britain, do you think that the Conservative Party or the right in general in this country can make the same sort of move?
Well, to a degree, the right in this country did make this sort of move in 2019. This was the single greatest electorate win in the last 13 years for the Conservative Party. The only one that gave them a serious majority was under Boris Johnson in 2019, where he promised essentially a vision that united social and economic conservatism. Where he promised he was going to be more protectionist, he was going to spend more, he was going to redistribute resources from the south to the north.
Sort of levelling up strategy.
The levelling up strategy. And he also promised to restrict migration. There were promises to, and again, it was broadly speaking a socially and economically conservative agenda. And this was, and there's been a survey that shows that the 2019 voters who swung from Labour to the Conservatives were not only more socially conservative than the average Labour voter, not only more socially conservative than the average voter, not only more socially conservative than the average Brexit voter, they were more socially conservative than the average Conservative voter. So that there is no ambiguity or question about what won the Red Wall. It was exactly this kind of an agenda. But I think where the difference comes in Britain is that national populist voters in Britain and in the English-speaking world in general are older rather than younger, and that's I think that's one of the reasons why we often find it hard to realise what's going on in the continent, because there's a narrative in Britain that right-wing populism is a backwards-looking movement and it's never going to appeal to young people.
Do you think that a certain amount of this and sort of the great awakening that we've kind of endured over the last decade has to do with the fact that it's just being transmitted through the English language? Like, I think it was even Macron who said basically we need to get all these English speaking or English ideas, out of our universities and stop our professors actually from speaking English. Or even Giorgia Meloni now in Italy, where she's banning English words in advertisements in a way to kind of reclaim their sort of national identity and build this sort of insulation from these sort of like pathological idea pathogens that were spreading all around the West.
Yeah, I would agree, and I'd say I'd be more specific than that. I think it's an American idea.
Sure.
That we're looking at something that's coming out of primarily American universities, and it's also come out of the fact that America post civil rights movement, it is that the kind of great racial reconciliation was supposed to produce economic growth for black people, was supposed to produce a better set of living circumstances. But what's happened in the period since the civil rights movement is that the black family has collapsed. Again, although there has been economic improvements for black people overall, they haven't been evenly distributed. They're still lagging far behind the rest of the American population, including black people who have come over from Africa. There's still there was a crime wave following the civil rights movement. So that I think all of these things, and that of course also brought increased tensions between black Americans and the police. And I think all of those things has meant that it's destabilized the American national project, and it also opened a space for a kind of left-wing populism about race. And I think that has taken hold of the American Academy and hold of American left-wing politics. And because America is the world hegemon, whether people, a kind of world empire, whether they want to describe themselves as that or not, when they sneeze, we all catch a cold.
Yes.
The Black Lives Matter movement, the time when we've got the internet, we've got there's a global reach for American culture. It became something like there were protests in Europe, there were protests in Britain.
Hands up, don't shoot. Even though our police aren't armed. Yeah, it can be very incoherent at times, and people sort of it's almost as if they want to impress the mother country by taking up its by adopting its political lexicon, even if it makes no sense in the sort of in British national circumstances.
Well, what do you think would be a good way then to insulate the UK from this, despite the fact that there's a shared common language? Like, do you think it's possible?
I mean, it's always difficult to insulate yourself from something when you're so closely tied to America, in ways that are organic as well as artificial. I mean, I think part of the problem is that in other European countries, they do have the language barrier, but they also have much stronger national institutions. So that somewhere like France, you look at the way that they back, they have laws that protect French bookshops from Amazon. They have laws that ensure that a certain number of films shown in French cinemas have to be French made. They back their industries up to the hilt. And I think one of the divergences between Britain and the continent that we don't talk about enough anymore is the great 1960s productivity divergence. Now, a lot of people may know that British productivity has plateaued since the 2008 crash, whereas it's continued to go up in Europe. What they may not realise is that Britain used to be the most economically productive country in Europe, but in the 1960s, France and Germany overtook us, and we have never caught them up. Nothing that we did since, not Thatcher, not anything, has brought British industry to the levels of productivity in Europe. And part of that is because we've deindustrialized, and because we have a system of labour that is it's caught between statism, which is a kind of public sector subsidy, state distortion of markets, which the right rightly condemns, but then their alternative is a kind of let it rip system, which exposes us to a global race to the bottom, in labour standards, in the inflow from capital and the outflow of British industry. Whereas in Europe, they've had a more corporatist model, which means that despite the many problems of the European systems, I'm not saying they're perfect and we're awful, but at least in this area, in terms of industry, they have a more corporatist approach, as we see in Germany, where there's more of a homogenization of the interests of workers and bosses. There's much more of a sense that you might start at the bottom and still go to the top. There's less of a gap in terms of wages at the top of industries and from the bottom. And so there's much more of a model of we're going to modernize our industry. We're going to make it work. They'll lose jobs if they think it's going to push productivity up, but they're not going to lose entire industries. They're not going to let the French, the Italians, the Germans are not going to let their car manufacturers fold. It's just not going to happen. And we've done the opposite.
And of course, so to bring it back to the idea of a sort of British populist moment, I mean, we had, in many ways, we did have our populist moment in 2016. It started in 2016, you could say it culminated in 2019, but we had that moment which was sort of registering, a question of registering radical distress at the way in which globalization had sort of unmoored people from their national communities. It had corroded, the importance of locality. People said we want globalization to slow down, and that was expressed very clearly in the 2016 referendum win. The problem is that populist moment was effectively hijacked by, and even though Johnson promised in 2019 to make good on that sort of to cash in the populist check, so to speak, in Parliament in 2019, he was basically a free trade open borders, liberal. Brexit as a project was hijacked by people who were much more in the cast of people like Daniel Hannan than Nigel Farage, and as such, we kind of, in a way, we've sort of wasted our populist moment. I wonder whether we can have another one. The question is whether we can have another one, and my sense of it is that it's going to be very difficult for us to have another populist movement for as long as, on the right at least, for as long as the Conservative Party is standing in the way of that, because the British system is set up to favour two parties, and it's very rare in British history that you get these sort of insurgent political parties supplanting the old ones. I mean, you had the Liberals, the Labour supplanting the Liberals at the turn of in the 1920s. You have weird sort of split. You have weird sort of breakaways in the late 19th century when Joseph Chamberlain sort of split from the Liberals on the issue of free trade. But usually in Britain, it's always been a sort of dichotomous political system, and so for as long as the Conservative Party remains in the driving seat, it's going to be very difficult for us to marshal the ingredients of populism for any kind of electoral victory.
Vote Labour, I guess. And hope something arises from the ashes.
That's what I think. Go on, sorry.
But do you think that there's something about in America, they're not having this problem as much. The populist movement hasn't died away, right? Like it's continuing to grow, even though it's been stymied at many turns.
Yes.
But do you think there's something about sort of the British cultural aspect of just like, I don't know, kind of like enduring civility at all costs that is preventing this from actually taking place and like really kind of taking root in UK politics? Like in America, people are not afraid to fight dirty, and they're getting dirtier like week by week now. I think DeSantis in Florida literally just banned DEI in all public universities. I mean, you could do that here, but I do wonder if there's like an aspect of
we need to be nice.
Yeah, and fair play that the British Conservatives are just unwilling to get down to the level of their opposition. They're holding themselves to too high a standard and unwilling to kind of fight fire with fire. They're getting burned nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, there's an association of populism as just as being as loud and mean as possible, and perhaps Donald Trump has given us that. But one thing I'll say about Donald Trump is I don't think his appeal, certainly the fact he was able to talk in a way that was more appealing to working class Americans, that he was more direct in his language, I think helped him. But the reason he succeeded wasn't because he was rude. He succeeded because he opposed the Iraq War, and because he said he was going to protect people's social security.
And he wanted to repatriate free trade. He wanted to repatriate American industry.
And he was going to beat China. And that was why he was elected.
Absolutely.
And because he was going to secure the borders. And those are the promises he made. And
it's the agenda, not the personality.
Well, it's the agenda linked to a personality that's seen as forceful and competent. Whether or not that's a fair account of Trump.
It's certainly not.
That's how he's seen by supporters.
My sense of it is that it certainly wasn't the so-called baggage of his personality that attracted people. I mean, it certainly attracted. There are certain people who did like the rudeness and the brashness. Even me at times, I will confess to laughing on occasion. But I don't think that was what sort of carried him over the line in 2016. But anyway, sorry.
No, and I mean, as you've pointed out, Harrison, it's the fact that in Europe they mostly have proportional representation. It's very easy for a new party to break into that system. And in France they have presidential system. You can put yourself forward as a French president.
That's what Macron did. I mean, En Marche didn't exist in 2016 when he ran. No. He just invented it on the fly, and the French Socialist Party of François Hollande was completely in the toilet.
And I mean, one of the strengths of the British political system is that it's not very easy to be an entryist, and it has tended towards institutional continuity. We have some of the oldest political parties in the world. That's how, and that's a strength when there is a continuity of tradition and a sense of public service, and people are able to get together, and they're connected to ordinary people. But party membership has collapsed,
completely collapsed,
and the problem is that both parties are increasingly, it feels like, in the hock of basically. I mean, I don't know how to put this politely. So we say boomers with strong opinions. It's the case of you look at something like housing policy in Britain. There should be a classic populist entry point for young people. Young people cannot buy a house. And they can't buy a house because there isn't enough of a supply of new homes in the areas where they want to live, and because there's too much demand in the areas where they want to live as well. And this could be solved in two ways, either by limiting demand, by limiting migration, and also limiting the inflow of foreign capital into places like London, where, like you've got all these half-empty streets owned by Russians, and you've got, hundreds of thousands of people arriving as cheap labour. And you could also control it by building new homes. But the fact is, the people who most benefit in this country demographically from the situation are older, wealthier voters
whose house
prices go
inflate,
up,
yes.
and cheap labour means they can still get affordable goods and services, and all the nannies and the rest of it.
Yes, but another dimension of the sort of the youthful aspect of populism on the continent is that you write in the piece about how a lot of these parties, particularly I think you mentioned in Belgium and Italy, actually try and generate a sense of social cohesion by actually getting everyone together.
Yeah.
And like in the 1950s, which was the high point of party membership in this country, being a member of the Labour Party or being a member of the Conservative Party didn't just mean that you sort of looked through the manifesto and ticked every box and thought, oh, brilliant, I agree completely. There was a whole sort of social dimension to the party memmembership.
Absolutely.
There was a sort of clubability to it. You would sort of play darts at the working men's club, or you'd go to black tie dinners in the Tory party. There was this sense that we were getting together, and that would obviously attract younger people into that tradition as well. And obviously that's something which doesn't happen in this country. But what sort of activities are being put on in Italy to get the young people enthusiastic and galvanised? So
Meloni has a quite controversial, let it be said, youth movement called Student Action, which is their membership's increased from 10,000 to 50,000. So I think it puts Corbyn, instead of Corbyn levels of support, but for a right-wing candidate.
Yes.
I think one thing that's important to bear in mind is with young people in Britain is we know they're more socially liberal than ever before. But there's also surveys saying that they're less democratic than any previous generation. So I think there was one particular survey that I cited in the article which shows that I think 41% would support a military dictator.
Yes.
46. And 61% support a strong leader.
There we go.
The problem
I took note of that.
And in France, I mean, the idea that the army should take over is as strong as ever. The one problem, I agree with that bit. I agree with it is true that there are these surveys showing that young people are sort of less attracted to democracy. I don't think it proves that as such. I think what it shows is that young people are less attracted to the sort of the parliamentary architecture involved in democracy, and this is a distinction, a very useful distinction, which a controversial thinker, but a brilliant thinker, Carl Schmitt, made in the 1920s. He made a distinction between what he called democracy and parliamentarism. I think young people are against the sort of the oligarchic aspect of our current democracy. It's not so much that they don't want there to be a sort of democratic spirit to political legitimacy. The sense is that that spirit should be embodied by a leader who becomes a sort of avatar for the people, rather than sort of having to sort of deal through the intermediaries of sort of MPs and parliaments. So no need for any of that nonsense. And the problem in this country is that even though in many ways that would suggest that populism can be a force in Britain with the young, it could attract them, given that there is this sort of disregard for political institutions. It seems to me that the reason why so many young people want a strong leader, it's more so that that strong leader can stop fossil fuels than stop immigration. That would be the reason why. I mean, certainly they have those views, is it not?
I mean, certainly, and I thought Corbyn's a good example of he was a populist leader with the young. I think it is more complicated than that, because I think young people feel locked out of the political process, and at the moment that dissident spirit, for all sorts of reasons, is channeled to the left. But in Italy, for example, the surveys that show that young Italians are the most socially liberal generation. They're more accepting of gay people. They're less racist than their grandparents voting for more moderate parties, and yet they're voting for a party which denounces the international LGBT agenda and wants to close the borders.
Yes.
And so I think it's very hard if you're in Britain in a political situation which is so different to understand that. But you've got to bear in mind this is a country where, first of all, there are cultural differences. This is a country where Dolce & Gabbana could also say that their ideal of the family is the Holy Family. But at the same time, I think it's partly that even that social liberals are also potentially signing up to national populist agendas because they see, immigration and globalization as attacking not only their economic status, but also social liberal values. So this is something that I think Le Pen has done very skillfully. Is she's, rightly or wrongly, she's portrayed Islam as anti-liberal. And anti-Republican, so that so that sort of Le Pen has been able to quite successfully lead a kind of right-wing Republican agenda, which has attracted liberal Republicans as well as conservative Catholics.
I see. And do you have a question?
I was just going to say, do you think if and when the Tories are decimated and people are looking for a kind of inspiration in the UK to kind of reform a conservative party, we're talking 2-3 years from now, so I just took note of them here. Italy will be still in Meloni's control. France will be coming up on its next set of elections where Le Pen, if she doesn't win outright, will at least come very, very close to winning again. Spain will have just gone through its election, which is going to happen next year, which it looks like is probably going to be pretty heavily right-wing. Finland as well. Sweden's now in control of the Swedish Democrats.
Sweden Democrats, yeah.
Poland's taking off. The top two parties in Belgium are now right-wing populists. And then, of course, Hungary and Budapest is becoming like a bastion around the world for any sort of conservative intellectual to fly in and give speeches at. Do you think that if and when the Tories get decimated, there will be an opportunity for some like new up-and-comers in the UK right to actually look to the continent and kind of take inspiration from all these countries which are having successes and build up back from there? Maybe, I think you mentioned in your article that Fox is doing like under 25 bar nights, right? Meloni's got now apparently a small army of Italians who are ready to run out into the street for her. Hungary, they have the MCC and all these different programs that have been funded by Viktor Orban and his sort of coterie of Hungarians. Do you think this is likely to happen? And if not, how could we make it slightly more likelier?
I think it's possible. I think at the moment that there's a very strong barrier to it, and it is the perception in Britain of Europe and in the right in Europe is so distorted that I think essentially you've got, for example, I saw ahead of the National Conservative Conference, there was an op-ed by Lord Frost
and Jacob Rees-Mogg in the Telegraph. Yes.
In the Telegraph. And, if you wanted to parody it, you would say, this is, could we be racist free marketeers? And this is not what's happening in Europe, is that you've got sometimes parties of the far right, but they're often trying to move away from their more from the
market-based economic analysis.
Well, they're moving away from the free market-based, and they're also trying to moderate their views. And this is whatever you think of national populism in Europe, it's a movement that is clearly capturing the imagination of young people, and it's about a resistance to globalization that is not based in the prejudice. It is trying not to just be based on the prejudices of the 20th century. That I think increasingly you've got older commentators, and on the right as well as the left, that just aren't able to understand what a new generation of national populists are doing and where they're going, which is it's much more about, we're going to reconnect with our European identity, but we're going to be a broad multi-ethnic coalition. We're going to be moderate. We're going to be, moderate on the role of the market. We're going to be moderate on the role of national identity and religion. And again, I think that these are parties that, even if they're beginning in extreme place, are trying to move towards, they are trying to forge a new kind of more moderate consensus that actually unites a very broad coalition of people. And that's why they're winning elections across Europe. It's not because they've driven half the population into an orgy of like racial panic. There are elements of nativism there. There are movements that actually are much more extreme out there. And I hope with my article I wasn't downplaying that. But I think it would be a mistake to simply dismiss millions of Europeans as being moved by the same mistakes of the 20th century.
My sense of it, though, is very much that in order for there to be that sort of, in order for that populist energy to be directed here, it would be necessary not just for the Conservatives to lose in 2024, but to lose pretty badly and to get decimated and really to get bloodied up in parliamentary terms, because when you go throughout British history, the times when there are sort of real political realignments, whether those realignments take place within parties, which has been more often the case in British history, or between parties, sort of new parties supplanting old ones, they tend to occur at moments when parties are going through an identity crisis of sorts. And I think that there's nothing like a great big stonking Labour victory in 2024 to provoke precisely that kind of identity crisis. Exactly. If Labour just get over the line, my fear is that the sort of people who are resistant to populism, however defined in the Conservative Party, if it's just a sort of moderate Labour victory, let's say Labour win by 100 seats or something like that, I mean really decimated. If Labour win by just 100 seats or something, it will be pretty easy for this, so-called, so to speak, sort of pinko liberal Tories who are sort of massively on board with free trade and open borders and all the rest of it. They'll be able to reinterpret that loss in terms which are favourable to them, and therefore that will sort of, I think that will delay the populist moment, the second populist moment, even more so. Whereas if it really is a decimation, then you do have a real opportunity for either redefining what conservatism is about from within the Conservative Party, or there being a whole new insurgent party altogether which can rise from the ashes.
So again, to everybody at home, vote Labour. Yeah, you heard it here first. The NCF.
Genuinely, if I don't happen to live in a swing seat, but if my grandmother gets is unsure at the moment. My grandmother's very, very conservative, and my family's reasonably conservative. They're not completely convinced at this stage, but if I lived in a swing state, I would genuinely vote for Labour at the next election.
Just accelerationism.
For accelerationist purposes. What would you say? Would you agree with that? I mean, would you vote for Labour as a way of sort of prompting the awakening the Tory Party?
Accelerationist. I mean,
slumber.
I probably have a range of left wing as well as right wing views. So I mean, I tend to spare both parties. So I was very disappointed with the Labour's housing strategy.
Oh yes.
So that involved freezing council taxes and opening up more loans for first-time buyers, which is, I mean, it's basically David Cameron. I mean, I don't think we're going to see much change in policy. So I feel very agnostic about the next election. But
sure, but I'm not saying I'm not asking whether you're a sort of staunch Starmerite, whether you whether you love the Labour Party, but as a sort of precondition for the sort of populist. Second populist moment we'd like to see, the sort of realignment we want to see. It seems to me that there are worse things we can do than go through 5 years of Starmer stabbing us in the front as a way of sort of as a way of sort of prompting people.
I mean, I don't know what will convince people to take more sensible policies here, other than this country going very badly wrong. I mean, I would say I have hopes that both people in the Labour and the Conservative Party will think differently about things. I don't know what the very necessary response to Britain's decline, and it really is now a very extreme decline, will come from, whether it's going to come from the left or the right or both. But it's vitally necessary, and clearly the Conservative Party losing badly at the next election would hopefully it will help people of all parts of the political spectrum rethink things.
Let's hope.
Now, just maybe to close off here, when I was doing some reading, and research to having you on here, I came across another article. Yours is called "The Kids Are Alt-Right," but Michael Anton, who's also speaking at NatCon, wrote an article 4 years ago called "Are the Kids Alt-Right?" Which was a review of Bronze Age Mindset by Bronze Age Pervert, which is a very interesting book that I'll leave our viewers to research on their own. But he ends the article saying, "In the spiritual war for hearts and minds of the disaffected youth on the right, conservatism is losing and Bapism is winning." And when you think about it, I mean, do you really see a lot of intelligent, kind of successful young right-wingers who are like extremely impressed with Rishi Sunak or like any of the directions that this way is going? I mean, the future is young people. I mean, it's the people who are going to grow up to inherit the political system that we're in. So it seems to me that the death of the Conservative Party, even if it doesn't happen in this next election, is only a matter of time, because it's failed to capture the interest of anybody with 3 brain cells to rub together who's under the age of 40. I mean, who's really engaged with the Tories at this point anywhere on the political spectrum? So maybe this won't be sort of Bapism that takes over in the UK, But I do wonder, what is the time frame for the eventual turnaround here? Because I mean, maybe it's even, if it's 15 years, a lot of these people are going to retire. It's like that old saying, like science progresses, one death at a time as kind of a new generation takes over. As, the people our age, I'm in kind of my late 20s, end up getting closer to our 40s, there's simply not going to be anyone left to take over.
No, and I mean, and I think it's good you mentioned that, because I think I should probably say just something very quickly more about there really are dangers here. So that, sometimes national populism is a very important corrective, and you get people challenging globalization in intelligent ways. And, you have someone like Giorgia Meloni who's talking about kind of how, we need to fight neocolonialism and things. And again, there's some important things being said, but at the same time, you've got people who really are genuinely post-Christian, neo-pagan racists, and those people exist. There's an Estonian far-right youth movement where they sort of they're kind of dancing around bonfires.
Yeah, they're all over Scandinavia.
Where they all want to get on horseback and join up with panther kick Nazis. I mean, this is there are really dark things here, and I think people would be amazed. You have all these counter-extremist people talking about the dangers of the far right, that no one's selling bombs, but I think they would be amazed if they knew the real scope of the number of young men who are quietly being attracted to these ideas in the English-speaking world. And I think when the left pushes so hard and negatively against people who have no racial or sex consciousness, and they tell them that you're bad for being a white man, I think they have and then they stoke up racial and gender politics in these really extreme ways. I think they have no idea the kind of dangers they're opening themselves up to, because the natural response of an awful lot of people, intelligent young people, to being told that they're no good is to follow the first person who tells them that they're worth something, and that it's good to be white, it's good to be a man. And that's why you've seen people like Bronze Pervert, like what's that mad Romanian sex trafficker?
Alleged sex trafficker. We should say for legal purposes. Still not charged.
Sorry. I'll correct myself there. So alleged sex trafficker.
Yes.
Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate. I think.
That's the kind of thing that there's a real risk people will actually go for.
Can I just say though too? I mean, it seems like a lot of this is already being mainstream to a degree. Where, I mean, if you took a look at Elon Musk's Twitter over the last few days, where he was tweeting about FBI crime statistics in America, I mean, this is the richest, one of the most powerful men in the world, talking about things that up until, maybe 3 years ago, were exclusively relegated to 4chan boards. So it does seem like a lot of this stuff is already seeping in, and I just wonder, we're already seeing kind of, magma bursts crack through the surface. And eventually there is going to be some sort of eruption. If it's not contained is not the right word, but diverted into something that's actually productive, it could become pretty predatory.
I think that my sense of it is very much, and it's sort of an urgency, which you in your piece at the end, you sort of say, political cultures across Europe are going to have to throw up parties which make intelligent challenges to globalization. Which make challenges to globalization, or they will be replaced. I mean, there'll be other ones which rise instead. My sense of it, in terms of the timing question, is that the sooner this sort of second populist eruption happens, A, the more intelligent it's likely to be, and B, the more staying power it's likely to have. And I think whether that happens, as I say, within the Conservative Party, which I think is probably less likely, or a new force from outside the Conservative Party supplanting it, the sooner it happens, the better. And maybe that party, if it talks about the sort of issues which you mentioned in your piece, will be able to galvanize young people in a way which, as Evan correctly says, the Conservative Party in this country is failing to do. Sebastian, would you like to have the last word? Very ominous. Do you agree with what I just said? I suppose?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's so important for people who are looking at this, who perhaps disagree, who see this as threatening, to see that globalization has destroyed lives, and the left has failed to respond to it, and that it's so important that people who are involved in mainstream politics find a way to engage with and to respond to national populism and not just condemn it. Not because there aren't valid critiques to be made of these parties, but because they are answering problems that mainstream politics is not. And if they simply repudiate them, if Hillary Clinton did, baskets of deplorables, all of that language, if they ignore this, it's not only that the movement will succeed, it's that far darker movements are waiting in the wings if those movements fail, and things can get so much worse.
Gosh, well, that's cheery.
Right to end on.
It's quite funny, just to end on this, with the national conservatism, you hear like the kind of like center-left liberals like decrying this movement that's run by like a group of Israelis and stuff, and it's like, do you have any idea like what the actual reaches of the right can get up to?
Yes, no, it's pretty ominous stuff, but hopefully we can turn the ship of state around. Sebastian Milbank, thank you so much for joining us. Evan, thanks as ever.
Of course.
You've been watching Deprogrammed. We shall see you next week.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.